suppose the challenge is that access to referring people to good quality palliative care to assess their symptoms properly and harness the benefits of available therapies and multidisciplinary care is often lacking, and often people whose symptoms are refractory, in their minds it may not actually be refractory if they actually receive interdisciplinary palliative care. And so I think some of the issues that people haven't sought the current treatments that we can offer those people and the support to their family caregivers.
And there's been some recognition that palliative care needs to be strengthened. There's been historically a stronger focus on cancer associated care, but increasingly we've got patients with neurodegenerative conditions that are dying. We've got heart failure, respiratory failure patients, and renal dialysis patients. So there's a range, renal impairment patients. So we've got a range of situations where we need to strengthen the palliative care options for people.
And their awareness and understanding that they have those open and available to them.
That just reminds me of a question though. One of the things we don't really know is who's going to pop out where. There's not a great clinical demand at the moment. Even if there's a sort of popular demand, but not a...
So one of that's really interesting in terms of the disconnect where if you have the privilege of having a whole range of experts from pain specialists and palliative care specialists, and again I'd like to put the caveat here is that we have the evidence base is being challenged because there hasn't been a lot of clinical trials and clinical work and well-constructed clinical trials. But having said that, the clinicians are not seeing this is the first line drug that they would be using in most cases. And even in Mira's, I think if we hear Mira's presentation just in terms of talking through the ethics committee dimensions of it and where the ethics committee has stood in her clinical trials, actually quite telling about where they see the evidence lying and the do no harm. And I think that's one of the challenges of getting that calibration of where the community is versus where the evidence is, where the palliative care physicians are at.
So my name is Uranga, I'm a palliative care physician in New South Wales and also an academic and have been involved in clinical trials for quite some time, really about interventions, both pharmaceutical and health service, aiming to improve quality of life at the end of life. So our study really is focusing on appetite, and appetite loss is a really common problem, and it affects up to 90% of people with advanced cancer. And often when it is in presence, it's often very severe. And as you would imagine, distress, it's not just the medical symptom. This is an issue that affects the social aspects of people's lives. It's a real visible and tangible sign of the person's decline, and is often associated with weight loss and decreased functioning. So the distress associated is multifaceted. And in terms of the pharmaceuticals that we have available, they include hormonal therapies such as progestins and also corticosteroids. However, the evidence really only points to very limited improvements, and there's quite a significant side effect profile associated with both those drug classes in this patient population. And in terms of the biology, there is some work in the animal models that suggest that activation of the CB1 receptor leads to a complex array of signalling that really improve the secretion of ghrelin, which is the hunger hormone. It seems to interact with dopamine transmission, which is around food enjoyment. And also there is all the inflammatory effects of these pathways. And we know that in people with abnormal appetite and weight loss in cancer, there is a significant inflammatory disorder that mediates those effects. So in terms of prior studies, dronabinol has been demonstrated to increase weight gain in people with weight loss in HIV/AIDS. However, there's been really less consistent findings for appetite. And the challenge, as Kerry said, these were done in the very early phases of HIV/AIDS, and no one has really replicated those studies in people now on be highly successful antiretroviral therapy. 2 large trials in cancer actually did not show a benefit, and as you can see, one used the cannabis extract with 2 different combinations and compared that with placebo, and another study compared it with megestrol, which is one of those hormonal therapies, and actually the megestrol group did better. And there's really only one small trial that took a slightly different approach and looked more at the types of food people were eating, looked specifically at pre-meal appetite, and also looked at taste and smell, and they did show some improvements. So what we're aiming to look at is actually looking at using the cannabis flower bud as a botanical product and using it as vaporized product. And to see whether it's well tolerated, whether cancer patients can use the vaporizer, and look at the side effects and the benefits, and really look at how that correlates with the blood levels of THC, CBD, and quite a number of other phytocannabinoids. And so the way it's being delivered is just immediately before meals, so we're looking at whether that is a better strategy than an oral compound, which has a much different delivery system in the bloodstream. And essentially the group of people will be adults with advanced cancer who have loss of appetite that's been unresponsive to optimal management, and that's where really effective palliative care and assessment of the issues that's causing the anorexia is really critical. And there's a whole range of conditions where it would be contraindicated to use a cannabinoid, and those would be people who would be excluded. So the study intervention is a Netherlands product, verdrobanol. And again, this is registered for medical use in the Netherlands. It's dried flower tips of the female cannabis plant, and it has a 13.5% THC content, and the CBD content is less than 1%. And it's actually quantified very specifically that we actually know the main terpenes that are also part of these other cannabinoids that we think may have some activity, so we know very clearly what those are, and we can measure those in the bloodstream of the participants. So the reason that we're using vaporization is that it creates a vapor without combustion, so there is no side-stream smoke and no smoke that the patient inhales. The vaporizer, which is here today that you can have a look at, is made from aluminium and medical grade Teflon, and essentially it heats the product.
There's no
inside.
product.
I checked already.
So the product can be measured using a pharmacy or a pharmaceutical clinical trials packaging company that can measure really accurately the dosing, and then this is heated, and then the participant just has to breathe quite normally and easily, as if breathing through a straw. So for the first study, so that we can observe people really closely and understand side effects and make sure that their safety is maintained, they will be admitted for a period of a 7-day, 8-night stay. We have a regional site in Cameron Island, Newcastle, and the St Vincent's Hospital site to allow that as many people within New South Wales can have access to both those sites. And a series of blood tests will be taken after the morning dose, and there will be regular assessments of benefits and side effects. And the intervention will be given 1 hour before meals, and the doses will vary during that 7-day stay. And as we really believe that appetite's a really multifaceted symptom, so not only are we looking at appetite, we're looking at people's food intake, their quality of life, hunger, the sense of feeling full either before the meal or after the meal, the taste and smell associated with eating, but also a whole range of other symptoms that they may be experiencing, including pain, mood and sleep, and really a whole range of side effects that are known to be side effects that can be caused by THC and also other cannabinoids. But because this is a much more complex phenomenon, we'll actually also do a qualitative interview with the participants to really get a more detailed understanding of their experience, how they found the vaporisation process, to let them explain a bit more about the benefits or the side effects. And so you would think that because consumers do have a really strong view that vaporising or using the botanical product as a whole, that there would have been research that had been undertaken, but there's been very few studies that have actually looked at this particular approach, and they've really only been in chronic pain patients. And the idea of using a vaporised route is that you may be able to get a much higher level of THC just before meals, with really not lingering levels after the meal when the person might not necessarily want the therapeutic effect. And so the idea is for us to establish what the therapeutic dose window is, to get that pre-meal appetite stimulation without the side effects, and to be able to do that in a predictable way, and understand how that changes if someone has liver impairment or kidney impairment, or if their body mass is different, or if they're on other medications, and all of those other things that Kerry talked about. And really the belief is that it may be that having THC and other cannabinoids in combination might exert something which is called the entourage effect, where that you get synergy in the effect but also regulatory effects on the side effects. And so by using the botanical plant, I suppose we're looking at whether there's any merit in that concept. And part of the way we're thinking about the trial is thinking about the packaging, how this would work in a hospital pharmacy environment, because people with advanced illness not only have care in the home situation, if this is something that would need to be taken further into clinical practice, we need to think about the operational issues of how people can be maintained on these therapies both in their home environment but also in the hospital environment. So I think the trials really help us understand how to do that in a way that will support the patients through those transitions.
Because I suppose one of the key issues with a doctor writing a prescription for a particular drug is for them to actually know the dose and the frequency, and you can see that there's significant gaps in a lot of that information that hopefully this trial will generate. And you know, it may not show effect. I think we go into these trials wanting the best science and the outcome, and obviously we hope that there will be positive outcomes, but we can't be absolutely certain, and patients will be given that information about where the evidence base currently is as part of their prerequisite for enrolling in the trial.
Can I ask, we've heard a lot about the limitations of the data and how much we don't know, but from the consumer's perspective, I guess they're probably wondering, well, when will we know? Like, how far off are we from knowing how effective these sorts of treatments are? It's like, is that a 10-year kind of
Well, I think
goal,
increasingly there's, I suppose, been more interest. So even though there's the 3 trials that New South Wales Health has undertaken, there's actually a number of other researchers that are doing various components. You know, University of Newcastle, New South Wales, Wollongong, they're all doing some other research. We are in an international remit. We'll also pick research up overseas. I think we will have better information associated with its utility in certainly areas where the expert panel thought it had the likely promise. So, for instance, or meeting the community need. I mean, MIRA's was very much around the community perception of benefit and what would be the angle there. The chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting is using a Tilray product, and it's looking at patients where even with standard care, some chemotherapy regimes still are significantly associated with side effects, and obviously we want people to get through the full course and complete treatment to improve their mortality, their 5-year mortality and survival. And so that one will give us that information. MIRA's will give us some information around its role, and that will be really important for palliative care commissions and GPs generally. But I think it will be a work in progress for many years. And often those countries, part of the issue is if there has been free availability of medicinal cannabis products through other routes, to some extent there is no interest or desire to do the research. And I don't know, Mary, if you wanted to comment on the sort of Israel experience where they're actually quite keen to collaborate on.
Yeah, and because they've been doing research, there's a chap called Professor Bashur at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem who's done a lot of work, much more from the chemical side of things. He's a chemist with an interest in pharmaceuticals. A lot of that's been, I think there's been some animal stuff associated with that. But amazingly, in Israel, there hasn't been much in the way of clinical trials. There's been quite a lot of slightly informal knowledge because people have been prescribing. They're probably the most advanced. When we get this green book fully translated, we might be able to answer your question slightly better, but I agree with Kerry, it has that feel of years, not maybe tens of. The Netherlands would have always been keen to get clinical trials going, but they expected Big Pharma to do it. They're in a good position if, because they've got a whole range of products through this company Vetricam, if Big Pharma got interested or if somebody else wanted to sponsor trials, you know, say the Gates Foundation or something, they could move off very quickly into organised trials. I suppose the only other thing to add is we are seeing greater interest in trials happening around the world. So there's talk of various trial activity in Spain. One of the pharma companies is thinking of running a trial here in Australia, which is good that they've chosen Australia to run the one that they've been running the early phases in Europe. They're going to run part of the third phase here in Australia. And we're hearing of a few other possibilities, and these are sort of green shoots rather than fully established issues. But again, it's one of those frustrating things.
It's not right around the corner.
It's not right around the corner.
No.
Would you say paediatric epilepsy?
I think
might be-
pediatric epilepsy is probably, in terms of the evidence for the cannabidiol, there'll be enough of the phase 3 trials reporting in the next year or two, and you'd have to think that the companies would be trying to get regulatory approval at some time for some of the conditions, and so that then, once there's a registered pharmaceutical available elsewhere, that does streamline the processes. But we don't want to preempt, clearly they've got to go through and convince usually they would seek the FDA's, get registered in the US and seek the FDA's, and we're not privy to all of the documentation that would be supporting it. We've only seen what's being put up in the public remit.
It's a really unusual space in that often clinical trial results are being announced in the media rather than at conferences at the moment. So it's a really unusual space. Everything is very unusual in this space. So, but there are people doing lots of work around the world. If you look on the clinical trials registries, there are many, many trials with lots of different focuses. So we talked about cancer, and people are moving from the preclinical to the animal models, and then we're moving from animal models into the potential of cannabidiol to enhance some of the brain cancer treatments. It doesn't work by itself in mice, so we don't think it would work by itself in humans, but maybe it has a synergistic effect with some of the brain cancer treatments. There's preclinical studies for some of the cannabinoids in animals about can it help with babies born without enough oxygen to the brain, and can it help protect the brain? So there's all sorts of things about to start happening. So it's a fascinating field that's going to just get bigger and bigger, but it's really hard for a consumer to navigate because the amount of information out there that's either unbalanced or erroneous is significant.
And it might be helpful, Jan, to explain the process with the phase 3 trial in the US and Epidiolex and how that impacts upon us.
So,
just to clear that up.
for example, the cannabidiol product Epidiolex is having its phase 3 trials in Dravet syndrome, which I think have all been reported now, at least in the media, if not to a clinical conference. They're finishing off a second phase 3 for Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. So the next question is, what type of epilepsies do they seek FDA registration for? Do they just seek registration for all severe pediatric epilepsy that's been refractory to other drugs? Or are they looking just for those two syndromes? And so that has a really big impact on the access to the drug, because if it's just for those two syndromes, that's a minority of the severe epilepsy cases. They're terrible, it's horrible, no one's discounting that, but there are lots of other children with severe epilepsy. So it may mean that we have an on-label use for 2 of the epilepsy syndromes, which are really important to control, and if you're a parent, this is really exciting stuff. It's too slow, of course, everything's too slow. Any medicines regulation pathway, the consumers will always tell you everything is too slow, but that's the closest to coming to market. Of course, we already have nabiximols sold as Sativex as an oral mucosal spray, but unfortunately a lot of the clinical trials are not coming out with overwhelming evidence that it's particularly useful. So for example, they've done some big phase 3 trials in cancer pain, and I don't think any of them have come up with, you know, hooray, this is really fabulous. It's all come up with, The other thing to really note is that
To change it, dance.
That's an epidemiological term.
Very specialist term.
It makes our trials.
But the other thing is, it's really important to realise that when we do these clinical trials, what we really do see is that reporting bias that we get from the consumers in the media. The consumers in the media are the ones who tend to have had the positive effects. What we don't see is the patients who drop off these clinical trials because they haven't enjoyed the dissociative effects of the THC and they found it actually quite distressing. We don't see the people for whom it hasn't worked at all. And that's got a lot to do with the fact that cannabis is illicit. So somebody isn't going to go up and say, I tried cannabis and it didn't work for me. They're just going to have tried it. But we do know that patients have been admitted to hospitals in New South Wales using some of these artisanal products, for want of a better word, or whose family members have tried to do something that they think is a good thing to do. And the patients wound up with a delirium, being admitted to hospital, been investigated, and then, 24, 48 hours later, mum comes clean and, wife comes clean and says, look, I was just worried for my husband. I tried to do something for him and I made him a hash brownie and it didn't quite work out the way that they wanted it to. So that's what we don't hear a lot of, is the people for whom they've tried something and it's either been a really expensive thing and it hasn't worked. And we also have some clinicians telling us about patients who are refusing standard care for, even early stage breast cancer, for example, because they truly believe that the cannabis will cure them. And they've been told that if you have chemotherapy or radiotherapy, it won't let the cannabis work. So of course then we see them later on when they've actually got an incurable cancer. So they've gone from what would have been a very curable cancer with our standard therapy to what becomes an incurable cancer.
It might be a good opportunity then to move on to medicines regulation.
Yeah,
Why
it's important.
Dr. Duke, Max.
Can I just ask at that
Yeah.
point?
Yeah.
Is that, you've mentioned a couple of times how big pharma just have not been into it and the dark surprise. I mean, is that because there just isn't enough evidence to make them think it's
I think one of the
worthwhile?
things is when they were experimenting with Trinabulol and Nabilone, they weren't particularly exciting drugs. And so the problem is and the other thing is, if you look at the US, what's the incentive to make a regulated product there when you've got all of this, and the US is one of the biggest markets, so what's the incentive to make a standardised product there?
When you can just buy it.
When you can just buy it off the shelf. So we know that a safe product often costs more, although in the case of the European,
the
Netherlands,
I was going to say cost,
yeah.
but in the case of the Office of Medicinal Cannabis in the Netherlands, they've shown that their product is cheaper than the black market product in there.
and
Not
even
quite a
for
lot.
us, I think some of the calculations would
We've
suggest
done
that
calculations to suggest,
if it was an appropriate use, and this is the problem, it's what's an appropriate use.
So I think, look, it's complex. It's really hard to speculate why pharmaceutical companies haven't been as interested. But I would like to say that the chemical, it's still a fascinating sphere for scientists. And if we had our scientists in the room and our chemists, they would just see this as like a menagerie of hundreds of chemicals of which we don't know the therapeutic thing, we don't know how to mix them together, and they would be just excited. So I wouldn't want you to go away from this room saying we're all doom and gloom, but I suppose we're saying that for consumers to have trust, for clinicians to have trust, they need to make their decisions evidence informed. And like all things at the moment, there's probably a mismatch. If we surveyed the community about the evidence base for cannabis products and we surveyed clinicians, we would see, Mira, we would see a very different, a disconnect, which is actually leading to some of the the tensions, and I think part of the role of the centre is to both work with clinicians around how to deal with patients, make sure that doctors are describing palliative care, that we're better at providing other options, and that we build the evidence as quickly as we can so that we can take use and take advantage of things that demonstrate evidence. And this is a very it's a very complex. One of the issues is, I know the trial hasn't commenced, but it's just on its very, very last things of commencing. But it just goes to the fact that the complexity, even with great focus, incredible focus and a great team, the nature of the illicit nature of the product and some of the regulations around it just do make playing with it a little bit more complex than potentially other things. Would you say, mirror that from your experience conducting other trials?
But on the other side of it is that you can harness the consumer view. A botanical product might be the way that they want to use it, and apply a research framework to understand that better and to do that in a way that's safe. So the two things I don't think are at loggerheads, and that you can actually work together, and actually there's a broad range of questions from a pharmaceutical to using the botanical product, and the trials and research framework can help us understand and work in partnership for both of those things.
Alright. Go ahead. Hello, I'm Judith Maxon, Chief Pharmacist. So I've been working on the regulatory side of things. So I'm going to try and sort of recap where the cannabis-based products fit in our way of thinking about medicines regulation in Australia, and in a sense it's the same approach in most countries. So the medicines fit in the concept of therapeutic goods, which is what the actual Commonwealth law is in Australia, the Therapeutic Goods Act. And we treat products that do anything with respect to disease, whether it be from across the spectrum, so whether it be preventing, diagnosing, curing, or alleviating the disease, or doing other things to test for diseases, are all considered therapeutic goods. So we have a very a particular threshold for making sure that we, as a society, we want to regulate things that affect our bodies, generally speaking. And what that does then for medicines is we have controls relating to quality, safety, and efficacy of therapeutic goods, particularly medicines, and then trying to make sure they're available. And we have an expectation that therapeutic goods are safe, of high quality, and a standard at least equal to that of comparable countries. And of course, many things are becoming into your minds in terms of examples of medicines that have been found not to be safe, and then sometimes, in fact, withdrawn from markets by medicines regulators. The most sort of celebrated one, I suppose, in Australia has been Celecoxib. So the Therapeutic Goods Administration regulates all these goods. They do pre-market assessment, post-market monitoring, enforce standards in the manufacturing, licensed manufacturers, and then often verify overseas regulators looking at information. So this complex slide shows that you have medicines on the left and devices here, and then there's prostheses here is another pathway. And the products themselves are assessed in the first instance by a very complex process to look at the quality, safety, and efficacy of the product. And then in the medicine space, some then go on to be considered for subsidy under the Pharmaceutical Benefit Scheme. But the last part of it is the post-marketing surveillance. So regulators internationally also follow up medicines use after they're on the market, and sponsors then are responsible for making sure information is kept up to date. So that's the process by which something like Celecoxib was withdrawn from the market, was because of that post-marketing surveillance.
Still there. Biox.
Biox, sorry, yes, you're quite right. So the benefits and harms are assessed. All medicines carry risks. That's inherent of them having an effect, a pharmacological effect. They can be minor or very serious. So the complex process in the TGA looks at scientific and clinical expertise to work out whether or not the benefits and harms are balanced. And often side effects can be immediate. Harms could be from prolonged use or toxicity. And then also you have to weigh up whether or not the medical condition is such that you would then tolerate a higher level of potential harm. So then that means that the situation in palliative care, that balance can be quite different. pressure are things that are only provided on prescription. Okay, so then what happens in Australia is we have registered medicines and listed medicines. So the terms registered and approved are generally sort of used interchangeably in Australia. But the registered medicines are prescription medicines that go onto the register of therapeutic goods, and the listed ones will tend to be more over-the-counter medicines and complementary medicines. So in this space, we're talking about registered medicines. So, and our framework also uses the concept of schedules that you hear thrown around, which is a legal concept really. But Schedule 4 is prescription-only medicines. So by definition, they are those that where the use or supply should only be where there is a person who's permitted to prescribe, has the skills and experience of a trained prescriber, and then available from a pharmacist on prescription. And you can inherently see why that seems a sensible thing to do when you're talking about something like insulin for type 1 diabetes. Very difficult medicine to use correctly, very easy to have excessive harms in terms of hypoglycemia. So you want to make sure you've got a trained professional helping a consumer use it correctly. And then Schedule 8 is controlled drugs. And they're substances that should be available for use, so they are medicines, but they require restrictions on supply because there can be abuse, misuse, and physical or psychological dependence. So in the cannabis space, THC is psychoactive, so it is classified as warranting belonging in the Schedule 8 classification for that reason. So what are prescribers' roles and how do they become prescribers? So medical practitioners gain authorisation to be a prescriber of a prescription-only medicine, one by way of their registration as a medical practitioner, which is now under a national law arrangement. But then in New South Wales law, that then allows them to be a prescriber of those prescription medicines under the Poisons and Therapeutic Goods Act and regulation. Prescribing is considered to be more than just the simple, like the act before you write on a prescription document is the information gathering, so what's the person's condition and what's the other tests that you've done, the decision making of the clinician, the communication and discussion with the patient, and then working out whether or not how you're going to follow up, see if the medicine's actually working is all part of prescribing, and then that results in the initiation or discontinuation of the medicine. And good medical practice includes informing patients of need for treatment, what their options are, and potential benefit and harm. So that's sort of inherently saying prescribers have to weigh up the benefits and harms and negotiate that with patients as part of good medical practice and as part of prescribing practice. So when we talk about unregistered and unapproved medicines, under the Commonwealth Therapeutic Goods Act, whilst it lays out the framework for having access to those registered and listed medicines, it also has a pathway for access in a limited way to unapproved medicines. So recognising that we need to do trials, so the Therapeutic Goods Act allows for trials, and it also has this other pathway for unapproved medicines, special access scheme and authorised prescriber scheme. So Mira will have applied for it's probably a CTN or a CTX? A CTN. So she's used one of the trial notification scheme under the Therapeutic Goods Act to be permitted to use the unapproved substance. And then the other pathways are more individual outside of trials. But recognising that unapproved therapeutic goods are things that have little or no, sometimes evaluation of quality and safety, and efficacy by the TGA. So that then means that the responsibility for prescribing them has to lie with the prescriber because the medicines regulator hasn't taken on that role.
However, there's sort of, all drugs are not equal, so even there may be drugs that are registered with FDA that are not registered with us, but a regulatory approval has been given by FDA. Yeah. That would give us more comfort than a drug that hadn't gone through FDA. So again, with all of these, there's tiers.
Yeah.
And it's not uncommon that we may, for rare conditions or paediatric conditions or for conditions that might not be marketed in Australia, we may go to drugs and use unapproved and use this pathway routinely for other things that we're doing.
That's right, and in fact, things like the special access my experience was things like, you know, an antifungal being imported to treat because it was an antifungal for a person, a very sick person where the antifungal wasn't marketed in Australia, but it was in the States, so it could be imported under special access scheme. So what we've now got with cannabis products in Australia is that we have only one that's regulated as a medicine in Australia, and there are some that are regulated as medicines in overseas. So dronabinol and nabilone are actually approved for use in the USA, and cannabidiol on the way at the DLX. But then unusually we've got this cannabis-specific regulatory regimes that Mary talked about in some other countries. And then of course there's the ones that are not regulated as medicines, and then they remain treated as illegal. So in terms of this framework, those then are those that we have no quality assurance for at all. In the cannabis-specific regimes, they can have quality assurance such as good agricultural practice and good manufacturing practice. So you know some things about the quality, but governments are not evaluating for evidence of efficacy. I think in any case, Mary, that's right, isn't it?
That's correct.
Whereas regulated medicines, we have the quality, safety and efficacy looked at by the medicines regulator, and then we have approved
I
product.
guess the
information
Israelis would be the exception. They allocate efficacy in a slightly non-standard way.
Yeah. So what we've done is, in a sense, tidied up the regulation in New South Wales to fit how you potentially could be authorising prescribing of those different groups of substances, recognising that most of them are unapproved therapeutic goods. So we amended this regulation back going into the legal detail to deal with medicinal cannabis products and other Schedule 8 medicines that weren't approved medicines. So it sort of will make it a straightforward pathway if there are substances that have evidence where they would be appropriate to use them. We do use an expert medical committee, as Mary said, to assist the prescriber to make sure that they've worked through all of the weighing up the benefits and harms appropriately, because it can be difficult for them to weigh that up on their own, in a sense. It has to have been lawfully manufactured or imported, so this process can't happen with the illegal products on the right hand side. And the prescriber has to find all the details of the product, so they have to find out what they need to know, because it's not provided for them by a medicines regulator. So we have a schema to help us work through that, and then whichever type of substance it is, there's a framework for us to understand how we would actually consider an application, which is what's happening at the moment. But what the medicines approval does, particularly for prescribers, for patients and doctors, is it results in improved product information. So in the case of nabiximols, which is this complicated complex of the actual cannabinoids within the cannabis plant, and it's been standardised, and then they created a generic name was created for that. So nabiximols is a generic name created to describe this particular composition of cannabinoids. That's in itself quite confusing. And then it's in a standard spray into the mouth form that's being produced as a medicine. And what it means then is that the approved product information tells the prescriber and the consumer, if they wish, structured and detailed information about everything that's known about the product that the evaluator accepted at the time that it approved it to market. So Sativex was approved by the Therapeutic Goods Administration in Australia, but the company has chosen not to actually actively market it. So it's not possible to buy it as such in Australia at the moment, although it is on the register on the ARTG. So the product information is then what doctors and pharmacists and nurses use all the time for any prescription medicines. So it's a structured and very detailed piece of information. So that's what we have for Sativex, which we don't have for the other types of products that are unapproved. I just brought one of those to everyone. If you've never actually had a look at those. And product informations are system
is only for multiple sclerosis.
But doctors can choose
Doctors can
choose to use
Prescribe
off-label, but again,
apply to use off-label.
but again, the off-label use needs to be well considered, and patients need to be informed around risk benefits and the rationale for why the doctor thinks it might work for another condition. Now that's reasonable because they're all rare, for rare conditions and rare neurological things, people will not necessarily do clinical trials or get it registered for all purposes. So that the off-label use, whilst we're not encouraging it, but it is reasonable for certain circumstances for off-label use of products.
So can I ask why we're not trialling that for the nausea? Because it seems to have a similar high level of THC.
So one of the things we need is the company to be willing to market it in Australia, to have it into Australia, so if the company's not particularly interested in sending it to Australia, which I understand there's been variable access. I think occasionally somebody's been able to access it, because it's not routinely marketed. There's it's much.
So I think it's a different question about clinical trials. Is that the researchers put in and a range of products they wanted to, and they did seek access. Some of the research proposals had drawn on that, but the company's also got to decide, or the person who owns the property for the marketing has to agree that the clinical trials, what they want to provide, even though they're not funding the clinical trial, they have to make the drug available for that.
And they should make it available.
It was requested in one of the
two of the trials.
and they chose not to. Well, part of it is whether they think themselves that it's going to work for that indication. So they make their own view, about that.
So my last slide, Natasha asked a question about what's the future picture, which is what you were discussing earlier. Look, if there will be, I think it is very exciting times for the field of pharmaceutics, so pharmaceutical medicine. So there will be further knowledge of pharmacology. The benefits and harms will be further described over the next few years. But because there's such a wide range of potential health conditions, working out the evidence for each one of those, when you have to go through early studies and clinical trials, won't mean that we end up with, it's unlikely we end up with cannabinoids being an answer for, all the range of potential health conditions. And then you've got to work out what its role of therapy is in each condition. As Meryl was saying, it's not always just a simple choice. And my final sort of history of medicine point is another example from plants, is that it's actually very unusual to have botanicals used as prescription medicines. Because mostly what we've gone on to do is isolate them further and have much more specific medicines in use. And that's because our science of receptor theory and our understanding of pharmacology is much more sophisticated than it once was. So when you look at the history of medicine with respect to treating asthma, originally belladonna alkaloids from